gambit. Now we can move on to federalism in theory. So before the break, I laid out the case that federalism has been widely misconstrued, mercilessly ridiculed, and meticulously bastardized throughout the 20th century. This has culminated in the past 2 years with Heather Gerken's progressive federalism lunacy, which I exposed in gory detail again before the break. The fact that her theory has been commended by Federalist Society elites and widely read conservative blog sites should certainly frustrate anyone seeking a return to first principles and or federalism, but it shouldn't surprise us in the least. Gerken is only the latest in a long line of infiltrators, usurpers, and malcontents to employ the academic and judicial interpretation gambit in an attempt to foment doubt among Americans as to the nature of our Constitution. She simply stands on the shoulders of many before her who sought to frame the framers as short-sighted or clumsy, and did so for widely varying reasons. The Constitution, as we will make clear, probably either next week or the week after, fully lays out the Federalist model of governance, and it is further enhanced by the doctrines of separation of powers, non-delegation, and, believe it or not, free enterprise. All of these are woven into the very fabric of our founding documents, and are inextricably linked to America's status, prosperity, and subsequent influence on the world stage. It is no wonder, then, that egalitarians, utopians, grand guardians, princely phylarchs, and the just plain misinformed have sought to disrupt this order from the very beginning. To answer the question of how this misinterpretation of the Constitution came to be so commonplace, to the point where the propriety of doing so is no longer even challenged, we must embark on a brief historical recap. The first among this interpreter set were, of course, the Anti-Federalists. Most of them argued that the Articles of Confederation were sufficient and therefore no Constitution was needed. These men, surely patriots all, rightly feared a large central government, given the tyrannical monarchy that they had so recently deposed. Their remedy for the issues that had arisen, which made the Articles largely unworkable, was to simply apply a handful of tweaks and call it a day. The Federalists, and what came to be the majority of the colonies at the time, understood that the issues that had made the Articles of Confederation unworkable included actual hot-shootin' trade wars between colonies, and something had to be done. So the Federalists, to their credit, agonized over the necessity of granting a little more power to a central governmental body. Accordingly, they spent the majority of that brutally hot summer hammering out clear language that would serve to, quote, bind the mischief of the general government, while reserving the vast majority of powers to the states, and, even more so, the individual citizens. At length, a new constitution was written, but it was clear that it wouldn't be ratified without concessions to the anti-federalist contingent, and in retrospect, that was a damn good thing. The arguments against this constitution among the anti-federalists ranged from too many weasel words to far too inclusive, and the far too inclusive that they referred to was of women and minorities, specifically, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. And another one of their favorite arguments, not enough emphasis on rights. Now, the latter is the easiest to explain because the end result is the original Constitution plus 10 that we know today. The Anti-Federalists feared that without drawing a clear line of individual rights in the sand, beyond which the general government was forbidden to step, all liberties would eventually be curtailed by some future despot. And they were correct. So, after much wrangling, this was solved by adopting what we now know as the Bill of Rights. But that's only half the story. The Federalists, pardon me, now balked at the proposed amendments and were even joined by a handful of anti-Federalists. They claimed that since these amendments laid out specific rights reserved to the people, future officers of the government would presume that list to be exhaustive. After all, why list only certain natural rights? Freedom of speech and assembly, but not freedom to wear a hat or not, or plow one's field shirtless in the heat of summer. Excluding these would surely lead the government to believe that they weren't meant to be protected at all, right? So to curb these complaints, James Madison, at the urging of Thomas Jefferson and George Mason, and borrowing heavily from their Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, added on Amendments 11 and 12. These are familiar to us now as the 9th and 10th Amendments, and are meant to be entirely complementary. Our 9th Amendment, contrary to the late Robert Bork's colorful and deplorable inkblot description, was the one that sealed the deal. It clearly stated that the previous 8 were in no way to be mistaken as man, this scratchiness is going to make me cough even more. And I actually got to the cough button that time. There we go. Switch back to the old standby. Much better. Now, the 9th Amendment clearly stated that the previous 8 were in no way to be mistaken as circumscribing the entirety of the natural and unalienable rights of the individual within the civil society that the Constitution sought to maintain. This one amendment, more than any other line in the Constitution, won over enough Federalists and Anti-Federalists to ratify the entire document. And still, objections were raised. Leading Anti-Federalists made their cases that certain clauses in the Constitution were troublesome. They argued that weasel words, such as general welfare and necessary and proper, would be contorted by future wannabe despots to suit their lust for plenary federal powers. This line of argument paved the way for the constitutional interpretation crowd, which has infected the halls of academia for well over a century, with Woodrow Wilson and Heather Gerken being but 2 notable examples. Now, James Madison, John Jay, and even Alexander Hamilton made it clear in the Federalist Papers that no such interpretation was necessary. The Constitution was, after all, a contract written in the plain English of the day to be applied and understood by lawyers and laymen alike in British common law tradition. As such, there simply are no governing clauses to be found. The contract must either be honored as a whole, amended according to the process detailed therein, or rejected outright. Those are the only 3 options that exist with a contract. This latter path, which has been trod thoroughly in the intervening years, the rejected outright path, is nothing less than an undeniable breach of that contract. Now, as previously stated, some of the Anti-Federalists and a fair number of Federalists were not happy with the 12 proposed amendments, only 11 of which have been ratified since, by the way, and we'll talk about the original First Amendment in greater detail a little bit later. But the Federalist arguments won the day at one state ratifying convention after another, and the new Constitution was eventually adopted. And the debates have raged on ever since over whether it means what it actually says, or if those who didn't write it somehow understand it more clearly than those who did. The framers would share a hearty gut laugh if they were to hear the hotly contested textualist versus originalist debates which consume so much of the available oxygen among judges, lawyers, academics, and Federalist Society scholars these days. I can almost hear James Madison inquiring in utter disbelief, can they no longer read? Has that one faculty escaped our posterity? Sadly, it would appear so, because in the intervening years, the classic fallback argument of those who seek to undermine first principles, federalism, and the very Constitution itself has been, how can we know what the founders really intended? Or, these clauses are vague and open to interpretation after all. Or, my personal favorite, that was a different age with far different technology. Surely the framers could never have predicted thus and such. Sheer nonsense, of course, every last syllable, but we can discuss two of those at another time. So let's focus on the vague clauses and open to interpretation argument. As I've pointed out numerous times, progressives seek to twist the language, first to establish their false premises, then to fortify them until they become accepted, and finally to teach these false premises as established foundational truths to new generations. This language twisting is so integral to every one of the progressives' ends that it has virtually been written into their ideological DNA, and to such an extent that they are no longer even cognizant of doing it. Worse, since the arguments were not even made against these false premises at their inception, or, if at all, only anemic arguments were made, the opposition now finds itself facing down largely accepted premises, with no leg to stand on toward the goal of refuting them. In turn, would-be opponents now find themselves twisting the language as well in a feeble attempt to temper the premise and steer the narrative in a direction that is only different by nominal degrees rather than truly opposite. So, after all of that backstory, combined with other expository articles, etc., written by myself and many others, and the 3 years of the Sons of Liberty show, where I've explained a lot of these things before, we can see how long the process has been, and how complete the undermining of our Constitution truly is. And this leads us into the various flavors of federalism that you will hear about in political science and constitutional law courses. Not all of them were coined by progressives, but every last one came about as the result of the progressive false premise of constitutional interpretation. And all of these terms have been used not only to mask what founding federalism is, but to destroy it by the old damned with faint praise tactic. So, let's explore each one of these in brief, and by doing so, clearly lay out what actual federalism is as enshrined in the Constitution. And let me check one thing here very quickly before I move forward. Oh, Lord. Okay. Pardon me, just some other stuff going on there. Alright, so, number one, and I gave the list a little bit earlier in the show, before the second break. Number one, dual federalism, also commonly called layer cake. Now this concept, and it's a very bitter cake, I might add, not moist at all, very dry. Anyway, this concept posits that plenary powers are granted to federal and state governments, with the sole restriction being non-infringement. So the states are not to assert authority in areas that the federal government claims jurisdiction over, and vice versa. In nearly every con law and poli-sci course, this is listed as the definitive founding-era federalism model, which, as I'll prove very briefly in a moment, is a purely fallacious claim. What none of these pointy-headed academics seem to remember is that pesky and far too often overlooked 17th Amendment. Before 1913, the Constitution mandated that the individual